Hello and welcome to part 4 of our 5-part series on housing and your living standard. These are housing decisions you make now that can affect you now and into retirement. Rick Miller is here today and he's going to be discussing should we downsize or dream size? And he'll explain what that means later on. In the past, we've talked about buying versus renting and how that affects your bottom line. How much house you can afford, should we buy a vacation house? And today, should we downsize or dream size? Today's webinar will be approximately 20 minutes long, and we'll do a Q&A afterwards. And you can ask Rick any questions that come up during the webinar. Please put your questions, type them into the Q&A box, and then we'll be able to ask them at the end. Thanks very much, and take it away, Rick.
Thanks, Carrie. As Carrie indicated, this has been we're in the midst of a 5-part series, and I wanted to start by covering or summarizing the major takeaways from the series as a whole. And a lot of them have to do with housing in general. Housing is a risky investment, riskier than people tend to think, and we're going to cover that in the last webinar in the series in just about a month. Also, it's a fixed expense, and we think about it differently, typically, than we think about other expenses. And it's important, if we're going to make good decisions about housing, to try to make it commensurate with other types of spending that we do. Housing is central to your living standard. Other fixed expenses are not. And today, we're going to talk a lot about housing influences your lifestyle. The lifetime balance sheet is a very helpful tool that we use in the work that we do, and it can be very helpful in making housing and other fixed expenses commensurate with day-to-day or month-to-month expenses. There's another problem with housing when we tend to think about it, and that is that housing expenses, some of them, are irregular, and that tends to cause us to underestimate the total cost of housing. And finally, the equity that you may have in your home is a lump or a chunk, but you can adjust the impact of your of owning the home over your life by tapping your home equity and using the resources in your home for other purposes. Okay, so now on to today's question. Should we downsize or should we dream size? When we're retiring, the housing decision is different than when you're starting out or accommodating a growing family. Your capabilities will change as you age, and your housing decisions have to recognize that. It's important to plan for the changes that are coming, and those changes can be both physical, and those are more observable, more obvious, but there are also changes in terms of the amount of emotional energy that you have. And those changes may not be as obvious, but they're important when we're thinking about housing in particular. And that gradual decline in emotional energy causes us to suggest that housing plans that preserve flexibility without requiring you to be nimble are more likely to succeed, because those are plans that you will actually be able to carry out as you age and as your capabilities change. So let's meet or reacquaint ourselves with the Robinsons. The Robinsons are the subject couple that we've been working with throughout the webinar series. And if you've been with us before, you've seen that the Robinsons have gone through quite a range of thinking about retirement housing, and they're planning to leave their current home, which is $1 million home, and they're planning to retire to a new home. And we talked about whether they should buy or rent, and we talked about whether they should have a vacation home. Today, we're going to think about, as I said, downsizing or dreamsizing. And as they, I want to emphasize that the Robinsons are in a simple situation. They earn a comfortable living. They're not financially stressed. They don't have to worry about their children. So we can focus on the housing decision. The Robinsons are saving and continuing to save as much as they can right now into their 401ks. They're adding the maximum that they can. Their employers are contributing. They're planning to buy cars until they're 85. They're going to be covering their Medigap insurance. They have substantial assets in addition to their home. And all of those assets and all of this saving is factored into the planning that we're going to discuss. So when we think about downsizing or dreamsizing, and you can read the text on the chart here, we're thinking about either reducing spending on housing so that we can spend more on other things, or increasing spending on housing and being willing to spend less on other things. And dreamsizing is spending more on housing because we think that we're going to get more out of the house, something special, something that really contributes to the way that we live. And I'd like to argue that the distinction that we make in financial planning and elsewhere between housing and the rest of our living standard is not as hard and fast as we might think. In general, when we do planning, we set housing expenses as fixed. We consider them to be unrelated to day-to-day living expenses, but they clearly have an impact on lots of other expenses. On, for example, travel expenses. If we live in a central location in the country, it's less expensive to travel to places that we might like to go. It has an impact on our cost of living. If we live in an expensive metropolitan area, housing is expensive, but other aspects of your living standard are also expensive, and more expensive than if you live in, let's say, a rural or a smaller urban area. And also, if you live close to attractions, you may not need to spend as much on vacations because your vacations are, if you will, built in to the place that you've chosen to live. So the Robinsons are thinking about, should they downsize or should they dreamsize? And the two broad alternatives are, first of all, traveling the world from a small, comfortable home, that's downsize. And that means lower housing expenses, higher travel expenses, more flexibility. Because their house is less expensive, they have more financial flexibility on a day-to-day basis. But on the other hand, there are less amenities in and around their home versus the Dreamsize choice. And here we're thinking about dreamsizing to the ocean, and they're thinking about buying a house on the water and using it intensively, and that's Dreamsize. That means higher housing expenses, lower, in this case, minimal travel expenses. They're thinking that if they buy this home, that their family and the rest of the world can come to them. They don't have to everything they need to live comfortably and well and to enjoy living the way they've always wanted to live will be right there. So that gives them perhaps more stability in their living arrangements. They're not constantly going to be flitting off on vacation, and more amenities in and around their home than in the downsize case. And the costs are quite different. So if they're dreamsizing, the house that they're buying is going to cost $1.1 million. And please don't. I would ask you not to ask me in the Q&A where you can buy a house on the water for $1.1 million. This is an example versus downsizing, and that house would cost $750,000. And the annual costs that are associated with the houses are also different. The Dreamsize house, the more expensive house, costs more to operate. It costs $42,000 a year. Whereas the downsized house is less expensive. It costs a little less than $29,000 a year. Now, to compensate for the fact that in the downsize, the Robinsons won't be living next to the ocean, they're planning to take some very nice vacations. And they're planning to spend about almost $40,000 a year extra on those vacations. And they're planning to have the vacation start in a few years and end in 2043. And I think that's the year that they are 85. But the most important point here is that the vacations do not continue throughout their entire lives. Now, when you're thinking about a financial plan, it's important to think about all kinds of expenses that might not immediately come to mind when you're thinking either about a downsize or a dream size. So, for example, the Robins should be sure that they're, especially if their kids don't live near them, that and while they might think that the children would like to come and visit them on the ocean all the time, if their children have children of their own, that may not be the easiest thing to do. And the Robinsons may want to travel to see their children. So that needs to be factored in to both the downsize and the dream size case. And then there are also auxiliary expenses. So if your dream size choice is, let's say, an apartment in New York, then you need to factor in the extra expenses that are associated with that. So restaurants are more expensive in New York City. You're going to perhaps want to go see plays and attend musical events and listen to the opera and so forth. And all those need to be factored into the cost of living at the in this case, the dream size location. If you're living in a remote location, you've got to travel to see friends and family. There may be sports equipment and passes that you're buying and so forth. In a resort location, everything's more expensive. Think about Hawaii if you've ever been. Everyone has a story about how much, everyone who's been to Hawaii has a story about how much seemingly things that should be inexpensive are expensive. And finally, if you're living in a community, there's the homeowners association fee. So all those factors need to be included if you're going to make a full comparison and a fair comparison. So the Robinsons have done all that, and now they're ready to make the comparison. And here's how it's done. So we're looking at, for each of the scenarios, so we're looking at retire and downsize with special vacations. Here they're retiring and downsizing and not taking special vacations. And here they're retiring and dream sizing. So the two that we're comparing are the ones at the extremes. But we've included the retire and downsize to allow us to see, if you will, what's going on in a step-by-step fashion. So we're showing how much they can afford to spend on day-to-day living expenses in each of the scenarios or each of the possibilities. In retire and downsize with vacations, they can spend $66,000 a year. Retire and downsize, no special vacations, $89,000 a year. And retire and dream size, $66,000 a year. The green line here at 65,000 shows us how much they're spending now. So either one of their either retire and downsize with vacations or retire and dream size, they're both feasible in the sense that their living standard doesn't need to change. And we're showing the differences between adjacent scenarios with these boxes in light green or lighter green. So it's about $22,000 a year. It costs them $22,000 a year in terms of living standard to buy those extra vacations. It costs them $22,000 a year in terms of living standard to move to their dream size home versus the downsize location. And it turns out that because I have, if you will, rigged the game, that the two options are equally expensive. So that leaves the Robinsons with the same living standard. So it looks as though they can afford either one with about the same expense, no difference. But let's look below the surface a little bit and see what else we can see. So when we say there's little margin in either case, we mean that relative to their current expense or their current living standard, it's about the same. So there's no extra. Whereas if we were thinking about just downsizing and not taking the vacations, there would be a lot of extra. I'll go back for a moment here. Here, there's a lot of extra relative to their current living standard if they just downsize. But they're planning to use that extra margin either for vacations or to buy a place on the ocean in this case. So in the downsize with vacations, there is more flexibility. They can take the vacation each year or not if they want to. So that extra expense, that almost $40,000 that they're going to spend on the extra vacations, they don't have to spend if they don't want to. They can let the property depreciate. That would allow them to spend more on a day-to-day, year-to-year basis. They don't have to keep it up. And if they don't keep it up, then they'll sell it for less, but they can spend more on their living standard. And finally, they could take a reverse mortgage. They could take equity out of their home, and that would allow them to spend more year to year and leave less to their children, but still more on a day-to-day basis. If they're dreamsizing, they could say, well, do we really need 2 cars if we're living out here on the ocean? That could allow them to spend a little bit more. There's their current consumption, that 65,000 or 66,000, includes $10,000 in vacations. Maybe they don't have to take those vacations because they're, if you will, almost on vacation all the time. They've got $10,000 in their consumption budget for eating in restaurants. Maybe they don't need to do that if they have this wonderful view from their dining area all the time. If they want more resources, they could downsize later in life. That may not be so easy to do. Remember what I said about emotional energy, but it's still a possibility. And again, just as they could with the downsize situation, they could let the property depreciate. That would give them perhaps a little bit more in terms of purchasing power extra because there's more to depreciate, or they could take maybe a larger reverse mortgage. If we look at this, and now I'm going to look at this from a lifetime balance sheet perspective, and we're looking just at lifetime spending. So we're not looking at typically or usually when we look at a lifetime balance sheet, on the left we'll have resources, in the middle we'll have spending, and on the right we'll have what's left available for the sustainable living standard. And here we're looking just at the middle column, the fixed expenses. And you see that the housing expenses are almost twice as much with the Dreamsize. The special expenses are substantially larger because of all those extra vacations if we're downsizing with vacations. The taxes are basically the same, and the net, the lifetime sustainable consumption, is just about the same. So the trade-off here is between what we would characterize the trade-off, but when we're doing planning, both of these are characterized as fixed expenses, right? The housing expenses and the special expenses of vacations. But that's a little bit misleading because the vacations are much more flexible. So if you think about the downsize, there's much more flexibility in terms of what could be done with the resources if there's a family emergency. If a year in, all of a sudden they decide that vacations aren't what they want, but classic automobiles are what they want. They could do that instead. On the Dreamsize side, there's less flexibility, but there's less need to for activity to sort of make up the enjoyment difference, right? Because they've chosen to live in a place that's wonderful to live. That's how they see it as wonderful. That's what they mean by Dreamsize. So because they're on vacation all the time, there's no need to pack up and go, and they're getting kind of a steady stream of enjoyment from their location. Whereas with the vacation approach, that I'm sure that the downsized house is nice, but they're counting on the vacations for the extra enjoyment, and that's episodic. So they're quite different from that perspective. Okay, now there are also hidden advantages, I would say, to the Dreamsize approach, and that is that the Dreamsize home is a more valuable asset than the Downsize home, and that means that if they need financial flexibility later in life, then the Dreamsize home provides that, and also there's a potential for a larger estate because the Dreamsize home is larger, and we've made the two scenarios come out equal from a consumption level or a sustainable living standard perspective, but a lot of resources are being spent on those vacations, which are more perishable, if you will, than the home that they've bought, the Dreamsize home that they've bought. So if we think about the estate and the size of the estate, there's a substantially larger estate in the case of the Dreamsize. And we're not looking at the whole estate here. We're looking just at the real estate component of the estate. But you can see that there's a substantial difference between 750,000 and $1.1 million. And so the Robinsons could leave that larger estate with the Downsize scenario, but that would require them to hold the resources that they were planning to spend on vacations out, hold them out and reserve them. Okay. All right, so where will the Robinsons go? And I would say that the big question to ask here is, do you love variety, or do they love variety, or do they prefer stability and predictability? If they love variety, then the vacations approach, Downsize and vacations, is going to be better. If they like stability and predictability, and they've been good at predicting that they will enjoy the Dreamsize location, then the Dreamsize is going to be better for them. Put another way, we could say, or we could ask, how do the day-to-day joys of the Dreamsize life compare to the more fleeting but higher highs, perhaps, of super vacations? And that's really a personal decision. And unfortunately, I don't know the Robinsons well enough yet to know which one they would choose. So we'll leave it there, and we're ready to take questions. Carrie.
Wonderful. Well, that was great. If anyone has any questions, you can please type them into the Q&A box, and then Rick will be able to answer them for you. Give people a chance to ask some questions. But so the basic one would be, so which one's better? I mean,
it really is a question of personal preference. I think that the Dreamsize has the advantage of a consistent or an ongoing experience that is the one that they have chosen and the one that they think is wonderful. And so that's, if you will, there's a certain idyllic nature to that, right? On the other hand, if you choose that, you're more, if you will, stuck with it, right? You've spent a lot of resources on the Dreamsize. There's less available to do other things with, and so if you're going to do that and make that Dreamsize choice, you want to be sure that it's a good choice, because you're going to be there, and you're going to be there, enjoy it or not. And when you make a large decision like that, the costs of exit are also significant. So if you buy the larger the larger place in the wonderful location, let's say, it's going to be expensive to exit if you find out in a year or two that it was really not what you wanted.
Right. So here's a question from Bob. He would like to sell his current house, which is a multi-story house, to buy a ranch to live as he and his partner get older. And he also wants a condo in a 55 plus community as a second home. And he's not sure if they should do winter rentals in Florida or actually buy. And what factors should we look at to make this decision? I think we should sell the condo later. We could sell the condo later if money became a problem. But
right. So
sorry.
Bob is asking us to sort of go through all of the webinars that we've already done, right? Buying versus renting, and should we buy a vacation home, and so forth. So I would encourage Bob to go back and see some of those, because the considerations are still valid. So the question about a vacation home, quickly we can answer by saying the vacation home is similar to the Dreamsize in the sense that it's in a fixed place. And so if you are confident that you've identified the place that you want as the vacation location, then the vacation home can be a very good idea. Mm-hmm. It's important to recognize that when you buy the home, if you have two homes that you own, then you are guaranteed to be paying for space that you will not be using at some point in time, because you're going to be in one of them or the other. And when you're in one, then the other one's going to be empty. And when you're in the other, then the one is going to be empty. And you're paying for the cost of that. So it's more expensive to do it that way, but that you don't have the costs of finding let's say a hotel or finding a place to stay every time you do a vacation. One thing that I would say is, and with the Dreamsize as well, I would really encourage people to try it out before buying. Try before you buy. So if you're thinking that you're going to buy a vacation home someplace, go there. Be there for a season, maybe 2 seasons before you buy. If you're going to buy move to a Dreamsize location, go and stay without buying before you make that big decision, because it may be very different than you thought it was going to be. And especially with Dreamsizing, if you're going to be spending a long time there, it's all year. So it's a good idea to try to experience as much of the year as you can, and so that you can gain confidence that it's going to be a good decision for you longer term.
Okay. Well, Paul asks, do most people in retirement sell their second home eventually to maintain financial sustainability?
That's a really good question. And I can't tell you about most people, because I've not done a survey, and I don't know of any research that would tell us. I would say that as people get older, it gets more and more difficult to maintain and operate one location, let alone 2. And it gets more and more difficult to travel back and forth. And so people do tend to simplify their living arrangements as they get older, because their capacity to manage real estate, it gets smaller because people have less energy, and they want to focus their energy on other things. So people do tend to reduce their exposure to real estate as they get older, And one way to do that would be to, if they have two houses, change to just having one.
Mhm. Okay, well, here's two questions that I can actually answer. One is from Dane, who asks, buying a second vacation home is another option, but that's a separate webinar, I suppose. And I can say, yes, that's the webinar we did before. We just did. And that webinar is available along with all the other past webinars on the Sensible Financial YouTube channel. They're all there. And then someone else asks, are the recordings of previous talks available? Yes, they are. They're all there, and you can see them anytime you want on the Sensible Financial YouTube channel. Now, Ron asks, what if you're already in your dream home? How do you factor in this cost of selling and moving to a more modest home versus staying put? Boston College once used 10% of sale price as the cost. Is that reasonable?
The cost of selling and moving, I would be the last to argue with Boston College about, and I'm thinking probably of the Center for Retirement Research there. That's a very excellent place. It's a major component of the cost of selling and moving is the real estate commission. And that's something that you can influence with your choice of realtor. So that's, and I'm not here to recommend one approach or another, but I can tell you that there's a significant range in the costs that people pay for buying and selling real estate, depending upon which realtor option they choose. So that has a big influence. The cost of moving will relate to, among other things, how far you're moving and how much you're moving. And if you're going to move to a smaller place, it's going to be less expensive to make your decisions about what you're going to move before you move rather than after. So I think some people, when they move, have a hard time sort of going through their furniture and so forth and deciding what they're going to take and what they're not going to take, so they take it all, and whatever doesn't fit in the new home they put in a storage compartment, which is then incurring costs month to month. And I don't have a professional experience with this, but my personal experience with this, not my own personal experience, but my family's personal experience, is that items in storage are almost never used and are almost always sold or discarded. So you can manage the cost of moving by managing the amount that you move, and I think that's very helpful.
Patrice has a question. What about selling the home, storing your stuff, buying an RV for 2 years, and then making the decision about Dreamsize or Downsize?
That sounds very interesting. I think that especially if you use the 2 years for research, I think that's a very thoughtful possibility. And I'm not, I don't know a lot about RVs, and I don't know a lot about how one would use that to explore, let's say, a home in one location versus a home in another. I think that it's hard to, that the places that you can park an RV, I think, are limited, and so it may not align really well with the physical location that you might buy, right? If you're thinking about buying in the mountains, let's say, the RV, the place you can park the RV and stay may be quite different from the place where you might buy. So there's that. I have that reservation, but I think that the general idea of researching before you buy makes a lot of sense, and I think it can save a lot of disappointment and a lot of expense.
So here's someone says, how do I determine the true cost of my home?
Okay. the true cost of your home. So there are two aspects to this. There is the capital cost, the price that you could obtain by selling, or the price that you have to pay. And then there is the ongoing cost of operating the house. And the ongoing costs comprise the ongoing cost of capital. And right now, the ongoing cost of capital at the risk-free rate is very low. Real interest rates are close to zero. So that cost is right now very low. A big cost that people often underestimate is the cost of what we call major maintenance. And for that, we use 2% of the replacement value of the dwelling. So that is if you own the home already, that replacement cost of the dwelling is shown on your homeowner's insurance. It is a number that is present on the homeowner's insurance, and you can multiply that by 2%, and that will give you an estimate of the annual cost of maintaining the house. Now, we're not saying that you're going to pay that 2% every year. We're saying that over time, it's going to average about 2%. And then you can think about, certainly there's real estate taxes, in the cost of homeowners insurance, all of that goes into the cost of the home. And then there are other maintenance costs that you might incur yourself, or that for services that you might perform yourself, or that you might hire someone to do. So those are things like cutting the grass, shoveling snow if you live in a climate where there's snow, doing the landscaping, and all that sort of thing, cleaning the house inside. So all of those together are going to give you a sense of the operating cost of the house. And then I would encourage you to calculate all that and compare it to what you're spending on other things. You may find that you're spending a lot more on housing than you think relative to what you're spending on other elements of your living standard.
PJ wants to know, do you borrow to fund the difference between the dream and the downsize house?
Do you borrow?
As opposed to, I guess, paying off the mortgage full on?
I see. That in general, I'm not a big fan of borrowing in retirement. I think that it's possible to get oneself in a little financial difficulty, because you may be you may not have a complete picture of how much you can really afford if you're borrowing to do that. It's one thing to borrow to buy a home that you're planning to live in, let's say from age 30 to age 60 or something like that, and you've got a 30-year mortgage, and so you're paying, in effect, you're paying for that over time, and you're paying out of earnings. And so you can compare that annual cost to the annual cost of other things. I think that the risk is that, and this goes back, I think, to the previous question. The risk is that people may think that the cost of the house is just the cost of the borrowing, right? I've got a monthly payment, that's my cost. That really understates the cost because of all the other factors that we talked about. In particular, the major maintenance, and people tend not to think about that and then be surprised when there's a large expense required to paint the house, in fact, if you think, and this is, if you think about so if you buy a condo and you think only about the monthly condo fee, and your condo association has not been good at maintaining a fund for major maintenance, there will be assessments, and there can be significant assessments. And so there's an example of the risk of underestimating the cost of owning, because people haven't been clear, and it's about what those costs are, and it's very tempting to do that and to underestimate those costs, because we want to live in a nice place, and um, but the risk is that we're kind of spending more than we realize, and then we get to a point where we kind of run into a wall because we've exhausted our resources. And in this case, perhaps we've borrowed money to buy a home that we can't really afford. That's the risk. That for me is the major risk.
Bob asks, could you please expound on the risks of home ownership, which is our next webinar?
Well, that is the next webinar, and I think, if I may, I'm going to defer that to the next one. But I will say that just in broad overview, the major risk is that the price of the home is probably less predictable than we would like to believe. And if our plan depends upon being able to sell the house at a certain point so that we can buy something else, and the plan depends upon getting X for the house, and we don't get X, then the rest of the plan could be frustrated. And I think that's really the way I would characterize the major risk.
Mike wants to know, is using a reverse purchase mortgage a good idea to buy the Dreamsize home? Not concerned so much about legacy, but more interested in saving investment assets.
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think that the concern that I have about preserving investment assets is that in effect you're borrowing either with this reverse mortgage or perhaps the mortgage that one of the previous questioners was asking about, where can I borrow to buy the dream house, right? We're comparing apples and oranges, right? Because we're borrowing at a fixed rate, we're borrowing in effect at a pretty close to risk-free rate, and we're investing in a risky asset. And so the expected return on the risky asset had better be larger than the cost of the risk-free asset. Otherwise, we're really making a lousy investment. But still, even though there's an expected return that's larger than the risk-free return, or the risk-free rate at which we're borrowing, the asset that we're buying is risky, and we might find out that we lose money in that investment. And if we do, then we're stuck with a loan that we have to pay off, and we don't have the resources that we thought we were going to have. So that's the major concern that I have with that. And and one might argue that it's there's a sense in which we're kind of fooling ourselves about how much resources we really have, right? We're saying, well, we can borrow money and invest and get great returns, and then we'll really be able to afford to live the way we want to live. And that's very risky once you're retired, because you have no other way to get resources. You're no longer working. And so if that investment doesn't work out, you're really stuck.
Okay. So Paul thanks you for your insightful response, which is very nice. And then John says, do you consider a change of jurisdiction region to take advantage of lower living costs, tax breaks, or lower real estate costs?
Do I consider it?
I think, would you consider, moving to a less expensive area?
Well, that's an option that lots of clients consider, and lots of people consider. And it can be very attractive. It can be, your resources can go a lot further in some regions of the country than in others. You can buy a lot more house in some regions for a given amount of money in some regions of the country than in others. And the factors to consider among the factors to consider, I would say are um, family relationships and friendship relationships. If you're moving far away, it may be more difficult to maintain those. COVID and Zoom, to the contrary, it's um, certainly you can keep the relationships going over Zoom, but if you want to see people in person, if you're going to make that move, you've got to factor in the costs of travel back to uh, your home location or your primary location. It's important to think about relationships that you have with the medical system and whether you have to construct those from scratch, and whether you can, whether and that is going to be a very personal and family decision. Whether some people have very important relationships with physicians, physicians who know them, who know their health, who know the issues that they may be wrestling with, and if you move, those relationships may have to be reconstructed. And then there's also the I would say, even if you're comfortable with both of those, I'd still try before you buy, right? Because it may be that um, even though you can save a lot of money in moving from where you are to a less expensive place, it may be that once you get there, you find that it's not what you want. So I would encourage that as well. Carrie, I'm afraid you're on mute.
I'm so sorry. What inflation rate do you factor into the planning? John wonders.
That is a really good question. Every year we estimate an inflation rate or that we will use to forecast, and we base that forecast on historic rates and the break-even inflation rate that one can get by looking at 10-year tips or 30-year tips versus 10-year treasuries or 30-year treasuries. So we start with historic average, we update it for what the market is telling us, and that's what we use. And this year we're using something in the neighborhood of 2.25%. And we're using that to forecast pretty much indefinitely into the future.
John asks, what is included in the $40,000 a year vacation amount? If it lasts for 3 or 4 months, you could replace the benefits of the dream home. Could it replace the benefits?
Well,
of the dream?
I mean, that's really that's the $40,000 question, as it were. In terms of this example, it's just an example. So it's the number that makes the number that makes the two come out to be the same. The two alternatives come out to be the same. So I don't have a specific set of vacations in mind. We'd have to read the Robinsons' minds, and they're unavailable right now. But I think that that's really the big question, right? Because and it's the question that you can ask yourself, and you can say, well, with that, in this case, the $40,000, what would we do? What could we do? And would that be, going to Hawaii and living in high style for a month? I'm going to confess that if you ask me about various vacation locations and what it would cost to live in high style, I will not be able to answer that question. But $40,000 is a good deal of money, and you could buy a lot, but you can certainly buy a lot more with $40,000, or a lot more time with $40,000 if you're visiting national parks than if you're visiting Paris and staying at the Ritz and eating in 3-star restaurants every night. So and then that's the question you have to ask. Given that you make the choice of how to spend the $40,000, is it going to Paris, staying at the Ritz, having very expensive meals, and making it up, we can afford to do that for 3 weeks at 40,000. I don't know if that's right or not, but versus with $40,000, we can go to 15 national parks and stay at the best lodges they have, and go on lots of tours, and drive between them, and we can spend 6 months doing that for $40,000. Again, not knowing if that's really a realistic number or not, but still, that's kind of the, and then either whichever one of those you choose, you are comparing to the sort of all year long enjoyment that you would get from the dream size of your choice, of your dreams. And I think that's that is the question that you have to ask yourself. And you could, if you will, you could try each one for a year, perhaps. Renting a place near where you want to dream size, and then doing that 1 year, and then doing the super vacations another year. That would be I think a useful experiment, and to see which one you prefer. And my strong suspicion is that some people will prefer one and some people will prefer the other. I don't think that there's a right answer here.
This, I believe, would be the last question. It's from Mary, and you did touch on this somewhat. She wants to know, does it make sense to use retirement savings to buy a house?
Well, I don't. I think that I would say that once you retire, all the savings you have are retirement savings. So if the question is, should we use money in our retirement accounts to buy a house? The answer could well be yes. It could be that you have enough. We see a lot of people who have all of their savings in retirement accounts. They have no savings outside of retirement accounts, but they have very substantial savings in their retirement accounts. And when we do a plan for them, we find that they have surplus, they have extra, which would allow them then to, let's say, buy a bigger home. If they have, so they have a house, we do a plan for them where they stay in that house and they spend what they're planning to spend, and there's a lot of extra. And then they say, well, can we buy a bigger house? We say, yeah, you could buy a bigger house, you've got extra. So, well, where's the money going to come from? Well, all the money's in the retirement accounts. Now, here is a case where you might decide that you are going to take a mortgage, because it could be very expensive to take a lot of money out of a retirement account all in one chunk. It could push you up, it could push you in a very high tax bracket if you did it that way. And so you might say, we're going to take regular, this is another topic for another time, but when people are retired, the objective in terms of taking retirement income distributions is to make sure that if you can, you stay in the same tax bracket every year. Mm. And therefore, it might be that if they need to take $300,000, let's say, out of the retirement accounts to buy that, to add to the equity in their home so that they can buy the bigger home that they want to buy. 300,000 in 1 year could push them up to the very top tax bracket, and they could be paying 15% more in taxes than they need to pay. So in that case, it might make sense to make a mortgage, to take a mortgage, and then take steady distributions from the retirement accounts, but still staying in the same tax bracket to do it. And that I would support a mortgage.
Okay, well, that's all the questions we have for today, and these were some great questions.
Very good. Well, thank you all for your questions. Thank you all for attending. And I'll just remind you that this is the fourth in a series of 5 webinars. The 5th one is in October on the 13th at 2. And the topic is, can you count on the value of your home? And here, what we mean is, how much should you rely, or is it safe to plan to use your home equity to fund your spending later on in retirement. So thank you all for coming. Here's our contact information if you'd like to reach us, and I will wish you a great afternoon.